Hi, it's me again. I'm just here today to talk about how to read a primary source. We're going to be using primary sources somewhat in our class. What's most important for you to know is that while we don't use them a whole lot in World History 152, we will use primary sources as historians. A historian's way of understanding the past usually comes from primary sources. So, what's a primary source? A primary source is any kind of document, work of art, artifact, painting, picture, anything that comes from the time and the place, and better yet, the events that we are studying at the time. So usually, as I've said before, history is driven by questions, and a primary source is a document, an artifact, a picture, a newspaper, a diary, a work of art, something that comes from the time and the event that we're questioning. So we'll look at primary sources in this course. We won't look at a whole lot of them, but you should know, as I said, that historians use primary sources more than anything else in order to find out about the past, because we want direct connections to what people were thinking, doing, and writing about when they wrote about the things that we are looking into. Now, the other reality with primary sources is that almost never has anyone in the past thought of people in the 21st century looking at the sources that they wrote. When someone in Africa writes a diary, when someone in Asia pens his or her business accounts, when someone in South America writes down a book on philosophy, they're not thinking about what historians are going to do with this document 200 years later. What they're thinking of is what the document is about for them at the moment. It has a specific purpose. That means that no primary source ever actually answers directly the questions that we have about past events. We have to sort of tease out what we want to learn from these primary sources. We have to kind of read between the lines sometimes, and there are techniques for doing that. And that's one of the things that we need to study a lot. So I'm going to introduce that today, and we'll take a look at that, and then hopefully we can continue to go back to these ideas and learn from them as we look at primary sources. So let me just zoom up here. The document that I'm using is on the internet. It's from the University of Iowa, and this is just called How to Read a Primary Source. So you can find this document online by doing a search for how to read a primary source and choosing the one that comes from uiowa.edu. Anyway, as we know in history, good reading is about asking questions of your source. You need to keep all of these different things in mind when you're reading a primary source in order to answer the question that you have. So again, the key thing that drives historians is not reading textbooks. We write textbooks based on questions to answer, or answers to questions that we have asked ourselves and done research into. So the textbook is really sort of 3 levels down the line, if you want to think of it. Normally what happens in the process is that a historian has a question. That historian will then ask the question of themselves, and that becomes a kind of research idea, and then we go to archives, we go to libraries, we go to the locations that we're studying, we try and find out as much information as we can about things that are related to that specific question, that time period, and then we use those things to write usually an article or a book about the answers that we've found to the questions. Then later on, a historian might come along and think, gee, I need to write a book about world history after 1500, which is what our History 152 course is. And as they write that book, they'll read all of these other books that historians have written about various specific problems in order to try and come up with general ideas. And that's your textbook. It's that really, I think, makes textbooks a little bit dry, is because they're not even bringing up many of these questions that are asked, and they certainly refer very rarely to the primary sources. What makes history exciting for me is these documents, because you're actually kind of communicating with people from the past. But you have to remember, they're not communicating with you. They don't realize that you even exist when they write these documents. So let's take a look. What we want to talk about primarily is that as a historian, you want to ask these questions, right? What can I know about the past based on the material that's in this document, all right? Another question that you should keep in the back of your mind, how can I be sure about what this document says? Is it a real document? Is it a forgery? Is it something that someone created later on and wants to claim is a real document? Or is it something that actually is from the time period, and how can I verify that, right? And that's this last question. How do I know the answer to these things? Well, historians have lots of ways of figuring out the answers to these things, and that's one of the reasons why we use footnotes, etc., because those help us to refer to the actual documents and make sure that we're talking about real facts and real documents when we do that. When you're evaluating an actual primary source, and we'll do that in another lecture very soon, you want to use this idea that the University of Iowa has come up with. It's an acronym, right? That is to say, it's a word that's made up of the first letters of other ideas. So in this case, the acronym is PAPER, all right? I know that sounds silly, but when you're reading a primary source, keep in mind PAPER. PAPER means, one, what is the purpose and the motives of the author? So purpose. Number two, you want to understand what the argument and the strategy she or he uses to achieve those goals is. So you have to read the document for those both. The third thing in PAPER is understanding the presuppositions and values in the text, both the author's and our own. And then you want to study the epistemology, that is, evaluating the truth content of this document. That comes back to this question, how do I know that these things are true? And then you want to relate this document to other texts. So you need to compare and contrast it to other texts to make sure that it's talking about the same thing, that it's written at about the same time, that it does or doesn't give completely different points of view. One of the things that you're going to recognize, of course, is that primary sources are not written to be objective. They are the ideas of people who are writing for a specific purpose at the time. That means that all of these people have an agenda of some kind. But remember, they're not trying to convince you at all. Their agenda has to do with things in the past that existed when they were alive. So they do have a point of view, and many of them are quite prejudiced in one way or another. That doesn't necessarily make the document useless. In fact, it can make the document very useful because we can understand their prejudice, and that helps us to figure out where that comes from. They may have a bias in terms of one thing or another. That is helpful for us because it helps us to understand how those people who created these documents understood their reality at the time. Now, of course, when we write history books, we try and avoid putting our own biases into the book. But it is important for us to understand the biases of the people that we study. So a primary source with a bias is not a problem as long as you recognize what the bias is. And that's part of understanding all of these things in PAPER. So let's take again a look at PAPER, and we'll be a little bit more detailed, okay? When you are studying a primary source document, right, the first thing in PAPER is to understand the purpose and motives of the author. Well, the website here explains that, I think, relatively well, and I want you to keep this in mind. In fact, it's probably even worth going to this website and printing this out to keep it next to you as you read primary sources. When you look at purpose, you want to find out who is the author and what is her or his place in society, and why do you think so? What in the text gives you a reason to think that this person is male or female, who they are, what their social class is, whether they're wealthy, are they related to the incident, how are they related to the incident that you're studying, all of those things. And then you, of course, want to figure out what could be, or more might it be, based on the text, right, and why. What's at stake for the author in this text? Why would the author be writing it? What does the author expect to get out of writing this text? And it could be something as innocuous as having a record of her or his accounts so that they know how much money they have or how much taxes they have to pay. Or it could be something much, much more beneficial or beneficial to the author, or something that brings a great reward or causes a great challenge or could bring a great tragedy to other people. So there's always something at stake for the author. People usually don't spend time writing even short texts if they don't have some good reason to do so. And you want to find out what that reason is. You want to try and figure out why you think they wrote it, and that's related to the other question, what is at stake for the author, right? And what evidence in the text tells you this. So when you have these ideas, when you come up with an answer to any of these questions, you really need to be able to say why in the text you think this is the case. What comes from the text, not their name, don't look them up on Wikipedia, all of that kind of stuff. You can do that as well, but your answers to these questions should really be justifiable by what you find in the text. And then, does the author have a thesis? Some authors don't. The thesis statement is a relatively modern way of writing an expository essay. If you're writing a diary, you're not writing an expository essay. You may not have any kind of thesis at all. You may just be writing. An account book doesn't necessarily have any thesis. On the other hand, a newspaper article would have a thesis statement of some kind. And anyone who's writing an essay should have a thesis statement. Government documents usually explain their purpose, particularly if they are laws. So you need to see if that exists and find it. That's very helpful to you. The next thing you want to look at here is this idea of argument. What is the argument, right? And the question is, how does the text make its case? What is the argument it's giving, and how does it do that? So you want to find out the organization and the writing strategy of the author. What is the strategy for accomplishing the goal? What is the intended audience? Who is this author writing for? And how might that have changed the rhetorical strategy? When you write for one group of people, you write differently than you would for a different group of people. And then what arguments or concerns does the author respond to in the document that are not clearly stated? Most authors are responding to a situation that exists in their world, or they may be responding to a situation that they expect to exist or to an argument of other people. You want to find out what those concerns are. The author may not, usually they don't tell you what they are. They will just respond to them. So you got to figure out what they're responding to. And then, do you think that the author is credible and reliable? Some authors are, some are not. You also need to talk about epistemology. So what is epistemology? Epistemology as the philosophy, the science of figuring out how we know what we know. And when we talk about epistemology with primary sources, we want to find out how might a text support one of the arguments found in secondary sources you've read. That is to say, what about this text is related to the textbook that you've read, or an argument in one of the secondary articles that I've asked you to read. So this text may support something that you've read that makes assertions about history in other places. And if it does, then that suggests that it is within a body of other texts that makes sense. If it doesn't, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a false text, but it means it's worth looking into. It also, you need to figure out what kinds of information this text tells you without knowing that it's telling you. We all leave different ideas behind that we don't recognize that we're messaging to people. And that comes from reading between the lines. Finally, you should relate this text to other texts. So you could choose another of the readings that I've given you, and you want to find out what patterns or ideas are repeated in both of the readings, what major differences are these two readings show, and which one you find more reliable or credible, and how you might explain those differences. So these are the things that will help you to read a primary source. And reading primary sources is really the key to understanding how history works and to creating your own interpretations of historical events. I wish you good luck. There's plenty of learning to do here. This is really only the beginning, but happy reading primary sources. They are really a lot of fun. And I'll talk to you soon about an actual primary source.